back at it again, and if you guessed another XX device, grab yourself a delicious cookie, you guessed correctly. But for many, the RG35XX SP has easily been one of the most anticipated devices from the folks at Anbernic. And after many months of speculation and teasers, the SP is finally here, and if the name is any indication, this device from Anbernic draws inspiration from a beloved handheld, the Gameboy Advance SP. In fact, you might have to do a double take at times because Anbernic's version is very close to its inspiration, but with some welcome changes and additions to help make their version feel familiar, but different. And naturally, that's what we will be exploring. So, as always, I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we discover Anbernic's latest and find out if the SP is truly something phenomenal. Let's first roll out these specs, and if you're familiar with Anbernic, these will sound quite familiar, but for those that are new to Anbernic or unfamiliar with the RG35XX SP, this handheld is equipped with a 3.5-inch 4:3 aspect ratio IPS OCA laminated display with a resolution of 640 by 480, much like Anbernic's own RG35XX Plus and H. We have the return of the Allwinner H700 with 4 Cortex-A53 cores at a frequency of 1.5 GHz and the Mali G31 MP2 GPU. This is very clearly part of Anbernic's plan to unify the XX lineup. There is 1 GB of LPDDR4 RAM on board with a 64 GB microSD card included in all versions that contains the operating system and more than 5,000 games. There is a secondary microSD slot available for storage expansion to add additional games. We have built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, mini HDMI out for video, and a USB Type-C for charging, which does support USB-C to USB-C charging. The SP includes a 3300 mAh battery that Anbernic claims lasts 8 hours, which we will be testing later on in this video. As I mentioned, it does ship with Anbernic's Linux-based OS. The SP should be available for ordering direct from Anbernic's Aliexpress or website by the time this video goes live, and will have a pre-sale price of $58.99 US for the standard configuration with a regular retail price of $64.99 US. I'd like to thank Anbernic for sending me this device for the purpose of this video. As I always require, they did not review this video prior to publishing. Alright, let's unbox this package, and there's no doubt about it what we're getting here with the nice minimalist outline of the SP right on the front. Quickly looking around, and really the most important thing to check out are the available color options, which are silver, gray, blue transparent, and the color that I received, which is the black transparent. Time to get the cover off and check out the actual contents here. This is a very compact box with not a lot of wasted space, so we will go ahead and get the smaller box out first and check out what's inside. Here we have the included USB-A to USB-C cable. At this point, I have so many of these lying around I could probably create a mega jump rope with all of them. Now, I don't mean to be a tease, but yes, I will be putting the SP aside for a moment while we check out the rest of the contents here. Anbernic has included a screen protector and the usual wipes, which is always nice and something I actually missed with the RG28XX release. Finally, we have the folded instruction sheet. This is definitely worth a read-through as it details some of the important hotkeys to use in RetroArch as well as some other useful information. It's now time to get the SP out and unbag it, but first, a little ASMR for your listening pleasure. And the reveal, and this transparent black is really beautiful in person. I was dead set on getting this in the transparent blue and silver, which I have to be honest, I will probably be buying at least the silver for myself. Let's just take a moment to admire this color and the way it looks and reflects off the light here. This looks really nice and clean and just like I remember with the SP, which fits nicely in the palm of my hands. Let's gently open the lid and take a peek of the inside here. My first impression for sure is that this feels very familiar and slightly different at the same time. But before we talk about all those differences, let's go ahead and take a quick tour around the SP and get familiar with the features built in here. We will start out at the back of the device and get our first close-up look at the shoulder buttons, which are in line, and yes, unlike the Gameboy Advance SP, we now have the addition of the L2 and R2 for additional inputs. The R1 is in a very similar location as it would be on an SP, and I'll be directly comparing the SPs to each other. For Anbernic, this R1 reminds me of the device I just covered, which is the RG38XX, but compared to that device, it's a lot quieter. There is a bit of movement in the R1 button, but they seem to press down nicely, and I'll obviously reserve my judgment for when I've used these a bit more. The R2 looks very similar to the RG28XX, but it actually feels very different from it, and I like the implementation of the R2 here. It doesn't have as much movement in the shell, so no wiggling from left to right, and instead it just presses down back as it should. It does have an audible clickiness, but compared to the 28XX, it's much quieter and ironically makes the 28XX R2 button seem very cheap in comparison. Moving along, we have the mini HDMI out along with the USB Type-C for charging, which are both placed in the center of the inline shoulder buttons. And then on that left side, we have the L1 and L2, and these feel similar, of course, to the ones on the right side. Now moving along the left side of the SP, we have the volume up and down buttons. These are pretty stiff to press down on and slightly more audible than the shoulder buttons. On the bottom, we have the 3.5mm headset port and then the two micro SD slots. The one on the left is for the OS and will be included with all SP devices. The second one on the right is for an additional micro SD card for extra storage. On the right side, we have the power and reset buttons. Let's head on over to the back of the SP, and the first thing that I'm seeing here is an actual battery cover that can be removed with one screw. Not only does this give me Game Boy Advance SP vibes, but it's actually a great thing to see in a handheld device. We will look at this in more detail during the teardown portion. Finally, there are 4 additional screws holding this bottom plate in place. On the top of the SP, we have no branding of any kind here, and Anbernic is not including any logos or designs here like seen in their earlier prototypes. This is a nice and clean design. For the transparent models, you can actually place a design inside the shell, which again we will talk about in the teardown portion. Opening up the lid, and again we have no Anbernic branding of any kind on the bezels here, with the SP using a 3.5-inch display. Let's get nice and close up now with the face buttons. In the center, we have the menu button, which looks to stay in place, unlike the one on the RG28XX. And now let's look at this D-pad, and I have to say that it has such a familiar sound and even feel. These use dome switches, and so we do get the clickiness that is expected with them. These sound very close to what I've experienced on a Game Boy Advance SP. We get a decent amount of movement here, and I think this can be seen when we look at the D-pad from the side. There's an obvious pivot from top down and left to right. It's definitely audible, but for me personally, it was expected since we are considering the Game Boy Advance SP, which also had an audibly clicky D-pad and face buttons. I will be spending some real time on this in just a moment, so hang on tight. Right beside the D-pad and in the middle of the D-pad and face buttons, we have the single speaker, very much reminiscent of the Game Boy Advance SP. Let's now take a look at the face buttons here, which are set up in the Nintendo style BAYX configuration. You can probably hear that they are quite audible, similar to a Game Boy Advance SP. These have a short travel, which tends to be the case with face buttons that use dome switches and can be seen clearly from the side. We're definitely going to go all in with the face buttons in just a little bit. Finally, below the speaker, we have the select and start buttons. So it's time to get the SP turned on for the first time and take a quick look at the stock Anbernic OS experience. This will not be a full walkthrough, as this is mostly similar to what I covered in the RG28XX review, with some exceptions because of the differences here with the 35XX SP. As usual, we have that annoying button sound, which is the first thing that I like to turn off, and I'll go ahead and do that before we move on. This is pretty much standard for the stock Anbernic OS, with the game rooms, RetroArch, favorites, history, search, app center, and settings all on the main screen. For launching games, I personally don't bother with the first option and go straight into RetroArch selection to launch games, as I prefer using RetroArch as the backend for the games so I can adjust settings as needed. The 64GB card that is standard on all models of the SP comes with quite a lot of preloaded games, which Anbernic states is over 5,000 games. The games are actually sorted pretty well, with no duplicates that I've noticed personally. Don't expect to see a lot of the PlayStation, Dreamcast, and PSP libraries, as they are much larger in file size. Quickly going through the library and platforms, and one thing I'll go ahead and show is the ability to favorite a game for easy access, which is a simple thing to do. When you've selected a game title, all you have to do is press start and it will automatically add it to the favorites section so you can access the game directly from there. The history and search sections are pretty self-explanatory, and for history, it shows the most recently launched games, with the search function being a pretty useful way to find a specific title you're looking for, and it does work well enough. Let's now head into the App Center, and here we can access a few included things like the MP3 and video players, an ebook reader, file manager, and then the apps folder, which has some additional things that we can use to make adjustments to the device. The stock OS treats things like the MP3 and video player as a piece of software that needs to be loaded, and therefore we don't have any multitasking capabilities with the device. So when you exit out of the MP3 player, for example, you will close it out completely. Let's now head into the settings section, and here we don't have a whole lot of things to adjust, but specifically for the SP, we do have both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on board, and this is where you would go to connect to Wi-Fi so we can make use of things like retro achievements. If you want a full walkthrough of the Anbernic stock OS, I definitely recommend checking out my 28XX video, which I will have linked here. So it's time to size up the 35XX SP and get some weights, measurements, and all of that fun stuff. I've got an assortment of devices joining in on the fun here, and I brought in devices that I thought would be fun to compare against, including the original Game Boy Advance SP. Let's first grab some numbers on the weights, with the 35XX SP up first, coming in at 197 grams, or just shy of 7 ounces. And then here is the original front-lit model of the Game Boy Advance SP, which is slightly lighter, coming in at 158 grams, or about 5.5 ounces. Here's a beautifully modded Game Boy Advance SP that came from an awesome Discord member. This Game Boy Advance SP has all of the nice modern amenities like USB-C, wireless charging, and a beautiful new display. It's only slightly heavier than the original SP at 165 grams, or just under 6 ounces. And then the only notable clamshell device that we've seen in the retro handheld space, with the beloved and perhaps infamous Powkiddy V90 that comes in at 110 grams, or a little under 4 ounces, making this one of the lighter devices here. And finally, for fun, here's my Game Boy Advance Micro that inspired my channel's logo, coming in at a very svelte 95 grams, or a little over 3 ounces. Okay, now we can do some size comparisons, and here we have two Game Boy Advance SPs lined up next to the RG35XX SP, which is in the center. You can see that they are pretty close in size here. Let's now go through a bunch of different angles and perspectives so we can get a better look at how the Game Boy Advance SP and RG35XX SP match up. So here's another perspective with the Game Boy Advance SP at the bottom. You can see that the 35XX SP is slightly wider than the Game Boy, and on its side, the same is true as well, with the 35XX SP being slightly thicker than a Game Boy Advance SP. Now let's place the Game Boy Advance SP on top of the 35XX SP, and it's a little tricky to capture on camera, but I will move slightly so you can see how the Anbernic version is slightly wider, taller. Let's go ahead and open up the lids to both devices, and again, it's just another angle and perspective here with a nice profile view of the sides with the lids opened up. And finally, here are both SP models opened up facing down, and I like this perspective, which again shows that while the Anbernic SP is not identical in size, I don't think it's drastically larger than the Game Boy Advance SP. Let's grab some calipers and get some actual numbers with the thickness of the RG35XX SP coming in at a little over 27mm, and compared to the Game Boy Advance SP, which has a thickness of just a little over 25mm, so the 35XX SP is about 2mm thicker, which isn't a whole lot. So let's go ahead and flip open both devices so we can take measurements of the D-pad and face buttons. The face buttons are essentially identical in size, with the Game Boy Advance SP and RG35XX SP coming in at about 7.5mm. Now obviously it doesn't take much to notice that the D-pad is much larger on the 35XX SP than it is on the Game Boy Advance SP, with the 35XX SP's D-pad width coming in at a little over 21mm, with the inside width of the D-pad coming in at a little over 6.5mm. The Game Boy Advance SP's D-pad has a width of just a little over 17.5mm, and then an inside width of 5.5mm, which definitely makes it smaller than the D-pad on the 35XX SP. It's time to bring back the Powkiddy V90, which is really the only clamshell retro handheld that is available, and the Powkiddy V90 is smaller than both the Game Boy Advance SP and the 35XX SP. The same goes for the thickness, and again, here are different angles showing that V90 is smaller for both the width and height. I'll go ahead and place the V90 on top of the 35XX SP just as I did before, and you can see more of the 35XX SP shell peeking through, since the V90 is smaller than even the Gameboy Advance SP as well. And I'll go ahead and grab the caliper again so we can get actual numbers here, with the thickness on the V90 coming in at 23mm compared to the 27mm of the 35XX SP. So let's measure up the D-pad of the V90, which comes in at a little over 6mm for the inside width, and on the entirety of the D-pad, the Powkiddy version is just slightly larger by about 0.5mm, so not a massive or even noticeable difference here. Now the face buttons on the V90 are smaller than the 35XX SP, coming in at a little over 7mm compared to the Anbernic's at 7.5mm. The Powkiddy V90 in general just feels cheaper and less refined when compared to the 35XX SP, and it's definitely a nice upgrade coming from that, but that is understandable given that the SP will be around double the price of the V90. Now before we move on from our size comparisons, let me just quickly compare some random devices with the Game Boy Micro back again, and it's just fun to see the Micro up against other devices since the Micro is such a small device. And then here's a fun modded Game Boy Advance SP that was turned into a slate. One of Anbernic's other H700 devices, the recently released refresh of the RG35XX 2024 edition. And then finally the big boy, the original Game Boy, which just dwarfs the 35XX SP in size. And I sort of alluded that the build quality of the 35XX SP is really solid, especially when you put it side by side with something like the Powkiddy V90. It feels very solid in the hands, and the quality of the materials being used here is very apparent. I don't have a solid color to compare with, but at least for the transparent black model I have in my hands here, I really like the texture and just the overall feel of the plastic. The body of the device is absolutely rigid. It's essentially a brick, and when compared to Nintendo's quality for the Game Boy Advance SP, I'd say it's on par and perhaps even better. Now naturally, one of the key things to look at here is the hinge, since we do have a clamshell device. And this is a little bit of a tricky thing to look at, since like many of these retro handhelds, time could potentially tell a different story, and only when enough time and usage has passed can we really judge the longevity of the 35XX SP's hinge. However, I think Anbernic did a very good job with this hinge, and it's very obvious they studied the hinge on the Game Boy Advance SP very closely. The hinge has one real locking position, much like a Game Boy Advance SP, with it being able to go a little further back from its locking position, again much like a Game Boy Advance SP. In fact, they are so similar that when I shake the device from this position, they both snap back to their locked position in almost an identical fashion. Now one thing that's different between the hinges is the very subtle click that we get on the Game Boy Advance SP, which is not present in any capacity on the 35XX SP. And finally, when pushing it down to close both devices, the 35XX SP has a little secret built into it that not even the Game Boy Advance SP has. If you look closely through the transparent shell, you can see there are 3 magnets that help keep that lid snapped shut. But they aren't very strong, and if I pick up the 35XX SP from the top of the device, the magnets and hinge both can't support the bottom heavy weight of the 35XX SP. Now compared to a Game Boy Advance SP, this isn't an issue both because it's slightly lighter and the hinge itself seems to be a bit tighter. And in all of this, the Powkiddy V90 somehow manages to impress with its hinge. I don't know what kind of sorcery Powkiddy did here, but the V90 has got a pretty great hinge with a nice satisfying click and snap, and even manages to stay shut when I lift it up from the top. So how about the display? Well, this is a pretty standard thing for Anbernic now, with that 3.5-inch IPS OCA laminated panel that we've seen in other devices like the RG35XX and Plus, and it's still pretty solid with a resolution of 640 by 480 and plenty enough given what we're playing on here. The screen has good viewing angles, colors, and my unit in particular doesn't have any backlight bleeding of any kind to make note of. I will say that I really love the out-of-the-box Game Boy Advance SP bezel, which adds just a nice touch to everything here, and really I love just taking in the crispness of the pixels. We've come a long way from the original Game Boy Advance SP with the front light that in comparison looks pretty awful. The stock firmware allows 5 levels of brightness, and at the max it does get decently bright, but it's not the brightest I've seen in this space. On the 35XX SP we only have a single speaker, but despite that this is a pretty punchy speaker that gets loud and stays crisp at those higher audio levels. It's in the same location as it would be on a Game Boy Advance SP, and your hands don't get in the way of the speakers, so with the speaker's location, we're not obstructing the audio in any way. Generally, I don't have any issues with the speaker, and I find it to be very solid. Here's a little sample of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And with Marvel vs. Capcom 2 already loaded up, let's go ahead and test out the D-pad, which didn't perform as well as I was expecting. Prior to this test, I hadn't really noticed it all that much in the games that I was playing, but I think with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, it became a bit more apparent that this D-pad will require a bit more force and concentration to pull off some combos. Performance for the D-pad was the same in either direction, so pulling off combos using different combinations wasn't impacted by the direction, and so I found it to be at least similar regardless of which side of the D-pad I was using. I tried out another game and checked out Super Street Fighter II Revival for the Game Boy Advance, and I definitely wasn't as consistent as I would have liked to have seen pulling off combos. Again, like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I really needed to put a bit more emphasis and focus on my combos. So, I loaded up Super Street Fighter II Revival for the Game Boy Advance on both my front-lit Game Boy Advance SP and the modded Game Boy Advance SP, and over on those devices, I did find it a bit easier to pull off the combos, so while the 35XX SP doesn't necessarily have a bad D-pad, I think this will be a very game-dependent thing. One final note, I did expect for it to behave differently than a standard membrane-based D-pad, and it's important to make note of that, but at the same time, I have to say that an original Game Boy Advance SP D-pad does work a bit better. And so building off this, I wanted to do something a little different for this video, and so for about the next 3 minutes or so, enjoy a segment of some satisfying clicks from a range of devices with dome switches, with the exception of the Powkiddy V90. Definitely skip ahead or use the timestamps if you want to pass through this, but I tried to capture the way each of these dome switches sound just slightly different from each other. For those that are watching, pay attention to the travel on these buttons as well. While the clickiness of the 35XX SP is definitely apparent, I didn't find it a whole lot more noticeable than an actual Game Boy Advance SP, and so for me it wasn't much of an issue, including the way the buttons and D-pad presses down, which again, feel very similar to a Game Boy Advance SP with a very short travel. These are very different than memory-based buttons and D-pads, and it's important to recognize and understand that difference. We will look at these in detail during the teardown portion. Finally, some last observations before I leave you with the soothing sounds of buttons. I will say that out of the range of devices I've tested, the DSi was one of the quietest, with the Game Boy Advance SP and 35XX SP being louder, and then devices like the TrimUI Smart Pro and PlayStation Vita being somewhere in the middle. Oh, and I was also reminded of how not great the D-pad and face buttons on the Retroid Pocket 2 were from back in the day. So, enjoy a little Retro Handhelds ASMR. We've spent all this time listening and touching. It really does seem appropriate in order to understand how and why the D-pad and face buttons work and sound the way they do. We should probably go ahead and take it apart. And as many of my regular viewers know, this is one of my personal favorite segments. The SP is ready to go, waiting inside my iFixit kit for its chance at a teardown. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, the SP has a separate battery cover that is held into place with a single screw. And in typical Anbernic style, we have the 4 other screws that require a hex bit to remove. We will need to size up 2 different bits here, but first let's remove the battery door and see how easy it is to access that battery. The battery cover is held into place with just a standard screw, so I'll go ahead and use a Phillips head size 00 bit, which should be a nice fit to get this single screw removed. With the screw loose, the battery cover comes out very easily, and we can get a nice look at how that transparent black plastic looks against my hands. The battery here is nicely wrapped so that it doesn't look as noticeable, at least with the transparent colors. Now I'll just use a tool to help me wedge in the gap and pop it out, and that appears to be all that's needed to get to the battery in case of replacement. The cable is connected at the bottom and it is pretty easy to pull out without much issue, and that's all there is to it. On the opposite side of the battery, we have our markings, which detail the 3300 mAh battery that's included here. Now coming back to the SP, the most immediate thing that I'm noticing is that Allwinner H700 on display. The other thing obviously worth mentioning is that this is in close proximity to the battery since it does rest on top of this location. Let's go ahead and now switch up the bit to a 1.5mm hex bit since we need to get the additional 4 screws off. And once all of those have been removed, the bottom plate comes right off without any force needed. The bottom part of the shell is surprisingly pretty rigid. We can now get a nice look at the entirety of the mainboard, which looks really clean and comes in black. We have the vibration motor at the top here above where the H700 is located. Let's go in and take a closer look at how these shoulder buttons are set up. The R2, as I mentioned earlier, is very similar to how it was set up over on the RG38XX, with a single standoff that goes into the shell, but unlike the 28XX, there is less room for movement, and so it doesn't rattle or make the same amount of noise. The R1 likewise is similar to the 28XX, but again, it's just a lot quieter overall, and I do think that the micro switches being used here have something to do with that, which are really high quality. At closer inspection, I don't think these will snap off or fail that easily since they are quite substantial. Now I just so happen to have a Gameboy Advance SP disassembled and ready to go for some comparisons as we continue here with the breakdown of the internals. Now interestingly, the micro switch for the Gameboy Advance SP is quite different than the one being used in Anbernic's version. The Game Boy switch is nearly silent, but it's quite mushy and has a rubber coating on the button itself. This explains why these shoulder buttons feel quite different. Now going back to the 35XX SP, one thing I did notice as I was looking around here is that the volume, power, and reset buttons were making rattling noises as I was handling this portion of the SP. I do think they are responsible for some of that rattling noise we hear when shaking the SP, and it would have been nice to see some small felt pads to help reduce some of that impact. So in order to proceed, we do need to change out the bit yet again back to that Phillips size 00 bit to get the 3 screws that are in place here holding the board down. Once those screws are out of there, knowing that this is a clamshell device, I'm going to assume there is a cable on the opposite side that connects to the display, as well as other components, so it's definitely a point to go a bit slower and carefully lift it out of the shell. And once I've gently flipped the board over, we do have a brief look at the opposite side, but more importantly, there is a cable that connects the display to the main board, so I will go ahead and carefully lift the retention tab to then release the cable. We now have full access to the board, and I love that this opposite side is white. Anbernic definitely did a nice job with the design of this. We also have a really good look at those dome switches that are being used for the D-pad and face buttons. This is where we get that clickiness from, and it's a fairly normal thing when listening to dome switches. Let's go ahead and compare this to the Game Boy Advance SP dome switches, which again are just so slightly different than what Anbernic has done with their version. If you listen carefully, they are just ever so slightly quieter than Anbernic's. Now it's definitely possible that given the age of this unit, it's just worn in more and so it's not necessarily an accurate point of comparison, but it does give a good general idea of what's happening under the hood. And back to the 35XX SP, here's a closer look at the rubber piece that goes in between the D-pad and face buttons and the dome switches on the main board. It's partly there to help with the movement and feel as well as dampen some of that noise when contact is made between the switch and D-pad and face buttons. Now let's compare the Game Boy Advance SP and 35XX SP membranes for the D-pad, which have similar design elements, but different enough that you could easily distinguish between the two. And looking a bit closer at the D-pads, it's obvious that they will be quite different since the Game Boy Advance SP is much smaller, but there are design differences between the two beyond just size. They both have a center peg which helps pivot for movement, but on the Anbernic D-pad, there are additional pegs that are used to help press down those dome switches. The Nintendo D-pad does not have this as a design element. The Game Boy Advance D-pad is also a bit flatter than the one found in the 35XX SP. Now comparing the face buttons, the Game Boy Advance SP has a much flatter button compared to the Anbernic one. The Game Boy Advance button is a little over 2.5mm thick, whereas the 35XX SP button is about 3.5mm thick, not counting the additional center peg, which isn't present on the Game Boy Advance SP button. The buttons are unsurprisingly not interchangeable from a Game Boy Advance to a 35XX SP, since not only is the thickness different, but they are keyed differently despite them having pretty similar diameters. Going back to the 35XX SP, the buttons are all keyed the same way. Since I accidentally had it come out, we might as well take a look at the single speaker, which actually uses contacts to make its connection with the board and doesn't use any kind of cable, which is a very nice touch and copies the design from the Game Boy Advance SP. So here's a look at the bottom portion of the shell with everything removed from it, and I really love the smoky black transparent color, which looks awesome in person. It's now time to tackle the display, and we will start by gently removing the rubber caps on the front of the screen. I used a very fine tipped tweezer to lightly grab out the rubber caps. There are 5 in total to remove, and once you've done that, we now have access to the screws. These are all standard Phillips screws, so I'll grab my 00 bit again and get to work removing them all. With the screws out, you're going to need some kind of wedge to get in between the two pieces. There are retention tabs that snap together to help hold the two pieces in place, even without any screws present. Be careful when separating the tabs, it's easy to bend the plastic, so just go slow here. And with that, the display will come right out, and the cable is even rolled up the same way as in a Game Boy Advance SP. Now let's take a look at the top cover, and on the transparent shells you can actually place a piece of paper with a design or a sticker of some kind to give it a bit of personalization. I think a Retro Tech Dad sticker will look pretty cool in here once I adjust the dimensions, or perhaps a Retro Game Core sticker. Now you know what? This Powkiddy sticker seems to fit in pretty well. Okay, I'm just kidding. I want to reiterate that if you plan on putting any fun designs in here, you do not need to disassemble any part of the bottom shell. You basically start at the front of the display, remove the rubber caps, screws, and then separate the two pieces carefully, which gives access to that sheet. The sheet measures 3 inches by 2.5 inches, or 7.62 centimeters by 6.35 centimeters, in case you want to plan out some designs in advance or size some stickers to this space. And it's finally time to talk about emulation and put this clamshell to use with some gaming. I'll do things a little bit differently here, and I actually will skip some of the lighter platforms that don't really have much trouble here with the H700 in the SP. So essentially everything from the 4th generation and earlier will be no issues, such as Super Nintendo, Genesis, and NES. Instead, let's start out with the platform that I really think is going to be the first thing that comes to mind when talking about a specific use case for the Anbernic RG35XX SP, and that of course is the Game Boy Advance. Now with the stock firmware, one of the immediate things you will notice when loading up a game for the first time with the SP is the slick bezel that is present around the image, and there are times that I actually have to look carefully because it really does such a good job of giving off that illusion that you're playing these games on an actual Game Boy Advance SP. The Game Boy Advance used a 3:2 aspect ratio display, so the border here is doing more than just looking cool. It actually serves a purpose to set the actual game image to the correct 3:2 aspect ratio on this 4:3 aspect ratio display of the 35XX SP. And with this setup, games look really great, and most importantly, the H700 chip has no issues playing the Game Boy Advance library. This is easily the most exciting thing about the 35XX SP for me, and I think for many others as well. There's no denying the nostalgia that I have for the original Game Boy Advance SP, and I have many fond memories of carrying it around as a companion throughout some of my early college days. The Game Boy Advance library is filled with tons of great games, and not only does it have the popular standouts, with entries in beloved franchises like Mario Kart Super Circuit, Metroid Fusion, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap, there are also lots of great Super Nintendo ports that made its way over to the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo did not shy away from experimenting with their franchises, and we saw a lot of very interesting titles from them like Drill Dozer, Mario Pinball Land, Kuro Kuro Kurin, and Golden Sun. Then there's the vast world of hidden gems on the Game Boy Advance, and one of my favorite things to do is just explore the massive library of games for new favorites or just to revisit some old gems that I miss, like Konami's Crazy Racers, Astro Boy, and of course a game I've talked about plenty of times with Iridium 2. Easily one of the coolest things about the Game Boy Advance was seeing how developers brought their vision of popular games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 to a platform that obviously lacked some of the power needed to carry out the full vision of the home console counterparts. Tony Hawk is just one example of this, and definitely don't dismiss it, as it's incredible what Vicarious Visions managed to achieve with the limitations of the Game Boy Advance. Besides it being a great game, all I remember was trying to shine as much light on my original Game Boy Advance screen so I could actually see what I was trying to do in the game. I could spend forever talking about the Game Boy Advance, and while this is a fantastic way to enjoy the library, the 35XX SP has plenty of power to go beyond just the Game Boy Advance. I think for many, including myself, the thought of being able to play Nintendo 64 games on the go back in 2001 when the Game Boy Advance released would have been an amazing leap coming from the Game Boy Color. But while we didn't quite get that in 2001, at least today we can enjoy a good portion of the Nintendo 64 library in a form factor like the Game Boy Advance SP, and really this just puts a smile on my face since there's truly something magical about seeing a game from the Nintendo 64 running on this device. Now, much like I talked about with the RG28XX, we don't quite have the full range of inputs to handle a portion of the Nintendo 64 library. But surprisingly, there are a lot of games that do work with this limited setup, and so it's worth exploring games that can be used with a D-pad only setup. I started to test some of my favorite D-pad friendly Nintendo 64 games like Mario Kart 64 and Wave Race 64, but I found that the controls were not configured properly out of the box, with no input being detected from the D-pad. So I went into RetroArch settings and I had to override some of the settings that were in place in order to get that D-pad to be recognized as an analog input. So in case Anbernic doesn't address this in the near future, just be aware that you will need to go in and set the controls properly to detect that analog stick input. Also, for whatever weird reason, some Nintendo 64 games were set to use the Game Boy Advance 3:2 aspect ratio, and that was another thing that I had to adjust in RetroArch to make use of the full 4:3 aspect ratio display. Now, what about some PlayStation? Well, it's no secret that the H700 in the 35XX SP will handle the library without much trouble. In fact, we can make use of the enhanced resolution option for PlayStation, so the games look much nicer here, and seeing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater load up on the SP is just a lot of fun since I remember being fresh out of high school with a Nokia N-Gage. Yes, only one of 4 people on the planet that owned one in 2004, and being able to play a port of the PlayStation version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on a portable device blew me away. And 20 years later, and I'm still loving the fact that I can enjoy PlayStation this well and have it look this good in a clamshell device that I can fit in my pocket. It's the simple things in life that keep me going, and I think for many PlayStation fans, this will be a platform that will get a lot of love on a device like the SP. One thing to keep in mind is that outside of a very limited number of games, the PlayStation library will work with the control setup that we have here with the SP without issue. Now think about this, the same year the Game Boy Advance SP released was the same year that Sega withdrew from the home console market and marked the end for the Sega Dreamcast. I think Sega would have been just fine if they had those Dreamcast games and a portable clamshell device like the SP. Since 20 years ago, that would have been something unheard of, but hey, at least today, we can live out some of that fantasy by playing Dreamcast games on this RG35XX SP. It's important to note that while we can play Dreamcast on here, and it will definitely fare better than something like the PlayStation Portable, the SP will not be able to handle the entirety of the Dreamcast library without some compromises, as the H700 doesn't quite have the power to do it without the need for some frame skipping or a drop in resolution. Additionally, there are some games that use both the D-pad and analog stick, and so naturally those will not work here. But I tested a lot of my usual favorites, and I just have to say Cosmic Smash looks so good on the SP, and I couldn't help but smile while I was laying in bed playing it. Now for Sega Saturn, well, you can forget about it. Just like I mentioned in my 28XX review, the Sega Saturn is not going to happen, and even the lightest games struggle with the H700. And while Sega Saturn is pretty much a no-go for the H700 and the SP, PlayStation Portable on the other hand will fare a little bit better, but like other H700 devices, this is really not meant for heavier PlayStation Portable titles. The main thing of course is that PlayStation Portable used a 16:9 aspect ratio display, so games on this 3.5-inch 4:3 aspect ratio display will look a bit smaller since you will end up with black bars on the top and bottom. PSP is configured out of the box to stretch and make use of the full screen, and personally I am not a big fan of stretching PSP games out, so one of the first things I did was put it back in its native 16:9 format. I was pleasantly surprised to find that we have PPSSPP running in the backend for PSP, since in the past, the stock Anbernic OS used the PSP RetroArch core. It was a little tricky to navigate the menu because of the display, but I did manage to get to the display options so I could adjust the aspect ratio. Again, for PSP, really just stick to the lightest of games like Loco Roco, but for this round of Anbernic devices, I'll show off another favorite of mine with Lumines. One last platform I wanted to talk about before we move on from emulation is the Nintendo DS, and out of the box, the Anbernic OS does have support for the Nintendo DS platform. This is a nice bonus for a device like the SP, since obviously we don't have a touchscreen, a second screen, or even the real estate on a 3.5-inch display to really enjoy the majority of the library. But there are a decent number of games that work great in just the single screen option, without the need for touchscreen controls, and games like New Super Mario Bros., Mario Kart DS, and even a personal favorite of mine with Geometry Wars Galaxies all work great, and for me, it's really the same kind of magical feeling seeing these Nintendo DS games make a jump from a much larger clamshell with the original DS to the more compact SP clamshell form factor. And after all of this gaming, let's now take a look at the battery life, as well as check out a few other things like sleep mode and the quick shutdown. So right off the bat, I tested my usual Yoshi's Island, but naturally the Game Boy Advance port with both the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth disabled, using the brightness set at 3, which is sort of the middle ground for this device, and volume at about 30%, and the RG35XX SP lasted more than 8.5 hours, which I think is really awesome. Now taking a look at the sleep mode, and unfortunately on the 35XX, it's not really a sleep mode, just like we've seen in prior Anbernic devices with the stock firmware, like the RG28XX that came just before this device. I did an initial test with Yoshi's Island for Game Boy Advance, and came back about 3.5 hours later and found that the battery life had nearly dropped in half, from 33% to 18%. So I took the SP to bed with me for the first time, and stayed up way too late playing a bunch of random games. The main concern for me was to see if sleep mode was truly a sleep mode, and to follow up on my initial test. This time around, I went into the apps section from the main screen, and then into the apps folder, where there is a way to set what closing the lid will do. And so here I made sure to enable the option to have the device go to sleep when the lid closes. But the reality is that this was already configured like this out of the box, and so I suspected that not much would change, even when I verified it within the apps section. So I finally put down the SP with about 62% battery life, and when I picked it up again after waking up and getting all the kids to school, the battery life was at 33% after about 7 or so hours. It's clear that the sleep function is identical to what I experienced with the RG28XX, a device that I just very recently covered. Now you can go back into the apps folder and change the setting to do a quick shutdown when closing the lid. This is sort of cheating the sleep function, and what this does is it will shut down the device when you close the lid, and then when you open the lid again, you will still need to press power to turn it back on, except that you will resume at the same point that you close the lid. So it's not instant like the sleep mode, but at least this will allow you to quickly shut the lid and not lose your progress while also not draining the battery. Of course, something like custom firmware could very well address the issue, and it just so happens that I have a bunch of micro SD cards already preloaded with a few options that I've tested and used on other Anbernic XX devices. I will say that I've grown to actually like the stock Anbernic firmware, as it's gotten a lot better, and really outside of the lack of a real sleep mode and some minor settings here and there, the stock OS is quite solid. But it's a very good thing that we already have a lot of custom firmware options out there, and thanks to Anbernic unifying their hardware, the options are plentiful. Now I only had time to test MuOS, but I did a clean setup by formatting and flashing my micro SD card with a build designed for the RG35XX Plus, and it worked without any issue on the 35XX SP, and I suspect the same will hold true for the other options like Newly and MinUI. No doubt, it won't be long before we see builds specifically designed for the SP, and hopefully one that makes use of the lid feature. Before we close this all out, let's take a quick look at the official Anbernic case for the RG35XX SP, and nothing too exciting here, but it does serve its purpose of further protecting the device if you wanted that extra bit of protection. I do like that Anbernic has been making custom fit cases for their devices, and this one is no different, with it securely holding the SP and leaving some room for a charger, cables, and whatnot. The outline of the SP on the top of the case is a nice little touch, and like many other Anbernic cases nowadays, also has the red Anbernic logo on the zipper portion. Personally, the appeal of a device like the SP is that it's a clamshell, and so really, this is just an extra layer if you're looking for that. And speaking of clamshells, this year is shaping up to be potentially the year of the clams. Anbernic is the first to the market with the RG35XX SP, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Miyoo might have something in the works with their flip device, and we've had teasers and speculation ongoing about this device for a while now. I guess we will have to wait and see if this device does drop sometime this year. Finally, I think that Retroid might finally give us, and of course Joey from Joey's Retro Handhelds, a follow-up to their original Retroid Pocket flip device from last year, but that too will have to be something we will have to keep an eye out for. And so in the here and now, the RG35XX SP is essentially the only clamshell option outside of the Powkiddy V90. And I think for Clam fans, the 35XX SP is a really solid device that gives those who are looking for the specific form factor a very solid option right out of the gate. I think this is going to be a fan favorite, and with Anbernic unifying the entirety of the XX lineup on that Allwinner H700, it only means that the custom firmware options will continue to flesh out and become more solid than ever. The 35XX SP is a great way to honor the legacy of the Gameboy Advance SP, but with some of the modern niceties of current technology. It's not entirely perfect, and I do hope that some of the smaller software issues are addressed. And so this does seem like the perfect time to wrap things up here, and I do appreciate if you stuck around for the entirety of this video, as we really took a deep dive into the 35XX SP and everything that makes it special. I don't think this will be the last time we see or talk about the SP on the channel, but until next time, as always, I am Rob, the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.